The original Mirror's Edge was one of the most graphics-intensive games of its time, especially with physics, which if you ever broke glass in the game or a helicopter shot at you and broke the glass, there was terrible lag for low-end cards, and it was all in the physics processing. Now Mirror's Edge Catalyst is out, and we've got the full GPU benchmark on the new game using our benchmark course that we published in yesterday's video, and that includes everything up to the GTX 10 series cards, 1080, 1070, and AMD's Fury X at the high end, and the 390X as sort of our baseline for AMD performance. Before getting to that, all of this coverage is brought to you by Enermax and their new LickMax Giant Open Loop Liquid Cooling Solution. So back to the benchmarks. We ran the same course 3 times on each card for parity using a couple different settings, 1080, 1440, and 4K for the resolutions, with High, Ultra, and Hyper, which is the highest setting for Mirror's Edge Catalyst. The test system is shown on the screen now. You can see all the parts we used there, but for more information on our testing methodology, the article is linked in the description below and contains more depth. Note that Mirror's Edge already has game-ready drivers from both AMD and NVIDIA. The drivers we used for testing are these latest ones as of today, and that's the 368.39 NVIDIA drivers and 16.6.1 AMD hotfix drivers. Graphics settings in Mirror's Edge Catalyst, again, go from low to hyper, and hyper is a step above ultra. The main options include an FOV slider for your field of view adjustment, and quick note here, it goes from 60 to 90 or 100, and at the very high end of that, unlike some FPS games, Mirror's Edge does get a bit distorted on our displays. So we didn't play with the 90 to 100 highest FOV settings. We used the lower settings just for a more default setup, since that's probably what most people will be playing on. The usual V-Sync settings are also present, and there's a couple of other important options like GPU memory restrictions, and that's one where you'll want to disable it if you're trying to test yourself, because the game will dynamically scale graphics based upon active GPU performance. So disabling is critical for benchmarking, which we did. You might want this on if using a card with lower memory capacity, like 2 to 4 gigabytes. The rest of the settings are the usual mix of texture quality, which is basically texture resolution, and post-processing, mesh, and reflection qualities. Reflection quality plays a bigger role in Mirror's Edge than most games, given that so many reflective surfaces are present, i.e. Mirror's Edge. Post-processing quality is also big, as Mirror's Edge Catalyst seems to derive most of its visual fidelity from graphics processing happening at the end of the pipeline after rasterization, and that's one of the settings you'll want to tune for FPS games. Before getting to the results for 1080p, 1440, and 4K testing, here's a quick look at some of the research we did. So I ran tests from high, ultra, and hyper at 1080p on a 390X, and this was strictly for my own use to figure out how I should benchmark the game, how we should run the tests on the different graphic settings, the cards, but it was worth publishing just to show the scaling of performance across different graphic settings. Ultra runs about 14.36% higher in average FPS than Hyper, 1080p during our quick research. High runs about 38.4% faster than Ultra, and then we have been unable to get Hyper reliably executing on some cards like the Fury X and 970, and that instability seems to coincide with devices running 4 gigabytes of VRAM. Devices running 6 to 8 didn't have this issue though. VRAM consumption is nearly 7.5 gigabytes on 1080p with Hyper settings, and is around 6.6 gigabytes at 4K with high settings. And then we saw 5 gigabyte utilization on 1080p with ultra settings. So it looks like the industry is continuing its push into games requiring more than 4 gigabytes of VRAM. Here's the chart showing 4K benchmarks with high settings. The GTX 1080 pushes the highest frame rates at 51 FPS average, and this is generally playable in Mirror's Edge, but you have to tweak some settings to sustain 50 plus FPS with better regularity, particularly in combat intensive scenarios. The Fury X and R9 390X both suffer from poor frame time performance and low frame rates at the bottom end of the performance spectrum, and the GTX 1070 holds better 1% and 0.1% low outputs than these two cards, but still sits at just above 38 FPS average. Here's 1440p. The R9 390X now sits at 53.3 FPS average, but still has poor 0.1% low performance. The 390X can generally handle 1440p, but would require some tweaks to improve low-end FPS. The Fury X has these same issues, but has an improved average at 63 FPS, and that puts the Fury X at 16.68% faster than the 390X, 1.57% slower than the 970, and 40.2% slower than the 1070. The GTX 1080, 1070, and 980 Ti are all performing at similar marks in this test due to some sort of bottleneck in the system. We're still investigating this, but it could be memory or some other limitation. I'm not positive yet. Either way, these cards perform effectively the same in performance. There's some variance in the lows, but really that could all be wrapped up as some sort of bottleneck within the system, and more or less the averages are pretty close to our tolerance for error. At 1080p Ultra, things loosen up a bit more. The GTX 1080 pushes 137 FPS and holds a noteworthy lead over the 980 Ti Hybrid, with a 21.86% gap between the two. The R9 390X does much better, but still has poor 1% and 0.1% low performance. The Fury X shows nearly a 95% gap in its average and 0.1% low dips, making for some visible and jarring frame output at times. The R9 380X holds strong at 56.3 FPS average, again with gaps in frame times, and the GTX 960 runs 9.88% slower in its averages than the 380X, but has 13.8% better 1% lows and 41.3% better 0.1% lows. The 970 and 1070 hold above 60 FPS average, with the 1070 and 1080 separated by about 18.5% in terms of their delta. At 1080p Hyper, the 1080 runs 29.5% slower than on 1080 Ultra, so that's the GTX 1080, just to be clear, on 1080p Hyper versus 1080p Ultra. The R9 390X holds at 54 FPS, about 25 FPS behind its 79.7 average at 1080 Ultra, and the Fury X and 970 were unable to complete this benchmark and exhibited instability that we believe to be a result of their lower VRAM capacities of 4 GB. So then, as always, a quick conclusion with sort of the best video cards, depending on what settings you're looking for, kind of your price range. At 1080p with Ultra graphics, if that's your thing, the GTX 960 and R9 380X both do pretty well in their averages, with the 960 generally pushing a better 1% and 0.1% low than the 380X. At a mix of medium and low settings, if you're willing to go down to there at 1080p, you could get away with the 950 or even the R9 270X if you have that older card in your system, but you will be running a mix of low and medium settings to achieve that, especially in the combat-intensive, post-effects, and physics-intensive scenarios. At 1440p, the GTX 970 is still a good card if that's what you're running. I know a large part of the market does have a 970. It's about 40% behind the GTX 1070 at this particular resolution, but still proves pretty price-friendly and is good with performance overall. The R9 390X hits about 53 FPS, 53.3 FPS average, and it's got a good frame rate overall, but again has those lower 1% and 0.1% low frame rate outputs, which is not great because there's some sort of sluggishness in gameplay at times, and hopefully that will be fixed with drivers or something else. It may even be a setting in the game. I haven't gone as far as individually checking every setting, but it may be the case that AMD struggles with one of those very specific settings in the game, and that could impact the low performance. As far as 4K goes, even at high settings, which is reduced from Ultra, of course, the GTX 1080 does struggle to hit 50 FPS, but manages to hit it on average. You would want to do some further tweaking to ensure that you stay at that 50 plus FPS mark. Mirror's Edge, generally it doesn't require quite as high a frame rate as something like Black Ops might if you're a competitive player, because Mirror's Edge is more of a single player game, but all the motion, all the movement, all the motion blur, all these FX will sort of stack up, and if you turn too quickly at times with the lower frame rate, like 40 or below, it really does impact gameplay. So you want to stay in that higher mark, 50 plus in this case. Overall, Mirror's Edge Catalyst, it was pretty consistent in its performance. It's one of the easier games to benchmark. You can find our benchmark course in the previous video, or probably scattered throughout this one, but everything 960, 380X or better if you're at the 1080p Ultra resolution, otherwise obviously a higher end card. As always, links in the description below for the full benchmark if you want more detail. Thank you for watching. Patreon link in the post-roll video, and subscribe for more information. I'll see you all next time.